Welcome to the Practical Consciousness Podcast with James and Lisa, where we help you tap into your highest selves in everyday life. Welcome to Practical Consciousness, the podcast with James and Lisa. I'm James.
And I'm Lisa.
Welcome, everybody, all the 12 listeners we have.
Hello. We have more than that. Stop that. We're all over the world. So
it's true. It is. We are global.
We are global.
We are a global podcast.
That's right.
So today's episode, we're going to talk about force versus power. And we're not talking about like Star Wars force. We're talking about force of will. And we kind of chose to talk about this because I'm happen to be reading right now the book by David Hawkins, right?
Power versus Force?
Yeah, Power versus Force. Yeah.
Yeah. I have not read that book, but I've read other books of his.
Yeah. And you get the general concept. But so the idea here is there is, and this kind of bleeds into the whole law of attraction. We kind of always gravitate back to that somehow. But if you read any of Esther Hicks or Abraham Hicks, any of those kind of books, they talk about the vibrational emotional scale, right?
Yeah.
And so this power and this force kind of line up with that general concept of that there is an energetic resonance that we all have, and when that resonance is low, or we're vibrating at a low vibration, or basically our power is low, then we try to force things. We try to make things happen. And but
not always, but sometimes
we tend to.
We tend to,
because we don't have a reservoir of power to be able to engage that.
Right.
So let's talk. What's your understanding of the difference between force versus power?
So power is something that we all have that comes from within. It's kind of like an innate energy that we have.
Yep.
We all have access to it. It's kind of almost like source energy, just like the divine energy. And then force, I would say, is like when you're trying to make things happen or force, like you're projecting on others, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good, perfect. Perfect. So we see force versus power a lot in like authority. If we've all kind of either had a leader or a boss or
teacher,
maybe even a teacher or somebody in authority that tends to push people to do things, right? They either order them to do it, they guilt them into doing things.
You use fear,
right? And that is an example of force. Military action is an example of force, right?
Yes.
I've got a whole group of people in another country or in another place that I want them to behave or do as I would like them to do. Therefore, I exert force via military action, financial, restrictions. Those are all examples of force. A really good example, our listeners tend to be, left brain
people.
Tend to be analytical and kind of logical in our approach to things. And so sometimes when we're fighting for the need to be right, or we are pushing people to accept maybe our level of understanding of a problem, or
to just hear us.
We oftentimes will use force in like using data, or force in proving our argument is accurate by just using facts, using pure, simple, hey, this is a fact, blah, 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 blah. Well, that is actually a form of force.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I never thought of it that way.
Because you're trying to convince somebody to see things the way you see them. a lot of arguments we see in social media, or especially right now, are centered around
Politics.
force. Politics,
Yeah.
yeah, that's force, right?
Oh yeah.
So then power, what's in those kind of examples we just gave of those kind of situations, how would, in your mind, how would it look different if we leveraged power versus force?
Well, to me, power is, I mean, love is one thing, but when you think of a corporate setting, you're like love, but love is acceptance, listening, understanding, all of those kinds of things. So those are the alternatives to using, force.
Exactly. If you go back to like authority again, right? So people in authority, we've all experienced people who have utilized power in that position versus force. It usually looks like motivation. Usually maybe they tell a story. They'll be vulnerable themselves,
Yeah.
because it's again, power is innate, and force versus power. That book we were just talking about, they have a scale in there. They've measured consciousness, and there's this threshold of 200. So the scale is from 0 to 1,000, and the threshold of 200, and it's courage, by the way. 200 is the emotion of courage. And there's that threshold. The fundamental difference is things that are above 200 are basically doing things for the greater good. They're doing things to build and to join and to, like you said, express love, where below 2000 or below 200 are expressions of selfishness, kind of a self-focused view, right?
Yeah. Anything fear-based or
Fear, shame
victim-based or
is the lowest. That's
shame. Yeah.
that's like 1.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
Grief is down there. Actually, anger is almost close to courage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if someone is feeling some shame or down there, those are the people who are going to go to most force.
Yeah.
And anger can actually be a way to move beyond 200, which is interesting. So if you have somebody who's like maybe very ashamed, sometimes getting them angry is good there.
Well, that's it. Esther Hicks talks about that. The whole,
right.
She talks about moving, up the emotional scale. Just, you don't try to jump from all the way down to from shame all the way to courage, but make little steps. And one of those steps is going to be anger. And that even follows, like in therapy, when they talk about the different levels of maybe, grief or something like that, where you make little increments. At some point you get mad for the person for dying, dying.
Exactly.
And you just work your way through all the.
And once you've met that, you've crossed that threshold of 200, you're moving into things like love. You're moving into
understanding,
compassion, kindness,
seeing everyone as being the same and not feeling separate.
Right. Openness, acceptance. You said those are all moving into and then enlightenment is 1,000.
Okay.
And so
it's when you have light shining out of the top of your head.
Well, remember, enlightenment means no longer burdened.
That's like Jesus.
It is like Jesus.
Or Gandhi, maybe.
Well, Gandhi actually.
Gandhi did. Yeah.
On that scale, he was in the 700s.
Yeah, he did. He did admit to being, to having weaknesses, and anyway, yes.
And so Gandhi's a great example, by the way, because look at that situation. Gandhi was put against a force of England using military action to force India,
force themselves on
submission,
India.
right? Mm-hmm. And Gandhi wanted a free India. They wanted to be free of England's rule, and he used his inner strength, his truth, his love of his own people,
yes,
to garner enough support from the people that they got angry and they said, we're no longer going to be subject to England's rule. And, ultimately they prevailed. And that's the thing, is power will always defeat force. Always,
Yeah. Okay.
always.
That makes sense.
And so from a practical perspective, I mean, things like confidence, things like knowing, we just talked about the kindness, compassion, love. When
Hmm.
you approach something, so let's go back to, maybe we've got a computer programmer or somebody who is just like feeling very justified in fighting his organization for being right about some code, or being
Yes.
right about the usability of an application or whatever.
Doing things a certain
Right?
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the difference between force being, I'm not confident, or I'm not convincing enough, or I doubt my own level to convince people, or whatever the case may be, when they step into their power and they're more conscious, this is, practical consciousness. When they're more conscious and aware, um, they might, they'll stand in that position from a position of power. They won't yell, they won't go into a room, they won't write nasty emails to their managers.
Right.
That's not the course of action they would take.
Yeah.
The course of action they would take comes from, maybe it's empathy.
Yeah.
Maybe they sit down with their leader and they say, I know you've been taking a lot of heat for us lately, and I don't like it. And, you know, um, I've, I've discovered this, whatever it is. And I think it would take a lot of that pressure off of us.
Yeah.
Well, that's power. That leader's going to listen to what that person has to say.
Well, and there's that whole idea of, whatever kind of energy you come at something, you're going to get that same energy back. You can't go in there forcing and expect the person to relax and say, "Oh, yes, you're so right,"
Yeah.
because they're going to sense that energy
Yeah.
that you're coming at them with, and they're going to feel it, and they're going to tense up, and they're going to be like, "No,
Yeah.
I'm not even going
Exactly.
to listen to you because of your, the way you're coming at me."
Well, physics teaches us that, um, every reaction has a an equal
Equal.
reaction, right?
Yes.
And so, if that action is a loving action, and comes from power, then it's going to get a powerful response.
Yeah.
If it's a force, is a position of force, it's going to probably get a forced response,
Yeah.
right? Which we see.
So people can probably relate to that if they think back to times when they've really tried to make something happen and they really forced it, and
Yeah.
how long it took to make it happen. Whereas when they go into something really open, how oftentimes you're so surprised at how quickly things happen. You're like, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing."
Mm-hmm.
And I've worked with people where we talk about that, where they're frustrated and they're trying really hard and forcing. And we talk about, what would it be like if you just relaxed a little bit and stopped trying to force it. And they're always amazed at,
Yeah.
once they do that, and how quickly, because they've already told the universe what they want, right? And then how quickly they manifest whatever it is that they're looking to
Yeah,
manifest.
exactly. And the media, what I love about what you just said is, if you think about that first step, is recognizing that what they're feeling in their body is, they're feeling that force, they're feeling that pressure, they're feeling that discomfort, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And so,
That's how you know you're forcing, by the
right,
way,
recognize
listeners.
it. It's like there's tension, there's tightness, there's,
Yeah. You're forcing.
you're angry, your emotions are on the bottom of that scale, and you go, okay, I am not utilizing power, I'm utilizing force. Just the
Yeah.
recognition is huge. And then
That's
you
where
can
you
ask,
start.
right, and then you can ask yourself, again, going up that scale, right, not just jumping right up to enlightenment or something. It's like, it has to be, it is a pure energy. So power is an energy. You can't fake it. You can't, like, convince yourself that, okay, I'm going to come at this at a very compassionate and a loving and a kind way, but yet hold my ground as far as having a boundary or having, whatever it is. Because power is, if it's real power, if you're coming at a situation coming from real power, there isn't any kind of like rolling over or being taken advantage of or being victimized in any way, shape, or form, because you're fully conscious. Yeah. So you're coming at, maybe you engage instead of anger, for example. So let me give you a perfect example. So if, let's say, you're in a situation, and let's use driving, because let's face it,
that works. Everybody
drives everyone catabolic.
Everyone can relate to that.
Yeah. So you're driving along, somebody cuts you off, classic, and you get pissed off. And we've already talked about it's a projection of your own judgment and our shadows and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But regardless of the reason, you're pissed off. And so whatever action you take from that position is going to be force, right? You're going to roll your window down and flip somebody off. You're going to scream at them, go on some diatribe about what idiots out there, how did they get their driver's license, whatever, you get it.
Yeah.
What's it going to accomplish? What's going to be the result in the end?
It's not going to be good. Won't be anything positive.
No, it's going to, if anything, it's going to, if you think about it, it's going to destroy. It force destroys.
Yeah.
So same situation. Maybe let's just say the same situation. Maybe I realize I'm mad and I'm being forceful or whatever, right? And so one of the first things I can do to shift into my own personal power is, we talked about courage, right? And so the courage to own my part of the situation.
Yeah, like, why are you so upset that the person cut you off?
Right.
Which we've talked about before.
And then the first step, the 250 or whatever it is openness. So if I same situation, somebody cut me off, I'm pissed off. Oh, look, I'm pissed. Let me have the courage to accept my own role in this situation, which
I'm choosing to be
pissed. I didn't yield. I didn't, I knew that person wanted to get in, and I didn't let them out of principle or whatever. Whatever. You have your story, right? Mm-hmm. Well, all of a sudden, if I'm open, I can from a position of openness, I can naturally more curious and naturally more willing to see more, right? My story is not fixed.
Yeah.
Well, that position of being open is stepping into power versus force. And then all of a sudden you might, I don't know, maybe an example of that is I actually back off, and I'm just like, let me see what this guy does if he's given the room and the space to safely, move quicker than the rest of the traffic or whatever. Mm-hmm. And sometimes my experience has been, anyway, is that person's force softens.
Usually. It depends on,
usually.
I mean, otherwise, if it doesn't, they're off. If you start to deal with something in a softer energy, a better, from a better place.
Power.
Yeah. That's the topic. Then that person's just not energetically attracted to you anymore. Whereas, like, if you were honking and stuff, they may slow down and come next to you and flip you off or try to push you off whereas if you just
whip out a gun,
if you just back off and let them go, now your energy's shifting, you're not matching their energy, they're off to the next person or whatever. They're just, they're going to go in a different direction.
Yep.
Because they're not naturally attracted to your energy, because your energy's, up here now. Isn't that great how that works?
Yeah. I mean, we're energy coaches. We we've talked many times on this podcast about the 7 levels of energy, the catabolic and the anabolic. Well, that's another way of saying force versus power. The people who are catabolic feel like they're victims, feel like they need to struggle and fight for every ounce of everything they have. Right?
Yeah.
We know these people, we coach them. They are
Yeah.
classic level 1, level 2, and they're using force because they're below that 200 level threshold.
Yeah.
People who tend to be anabolic, and again, it's a spectrum. The people who tend to be anabolic tend to be utilizing more of their power, their own inner strength.
Yeah. They have an
And
understanding. Whether it's innate or it's learned, but they have an understanding of how it works, the power and the energy levels. And they just know, well, if I flip this guy off, guess what I'm going to get? I mean, they just know. Where I think other people who are at lower levels, more catabolic levels of energy, they don't know, or they do know and they don't care.
That's right.
They haven't hit a point yet where they don't want to experience the suffering that's caused by this lower level of energy.
Well, they can. They can't see it really.
They can't see it.
It's like they're distracted from it.
Yeah. Sometimes you can see it a little bit. Sometimes you can be kind of in and out, in and out, in and out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
Sometimes they do know better. It's like, you know better. You know better. So we need to give a practical tool.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, okay, so here is some ways to, one, become aware when you're using force and when you're versus power. Yeah. And two, and probably the most important, is how to switch and find your power. And this is one of those deals where it sounds simple, and it is. Yeah. It just isn't easy.
Yeah. It's not always easy in the moment.
As far as awareness goes, there's two main things you can do. We already talked about. One is notice.
Yeah, pay attention to your body, how you feel.
Notice the tightness, notice the tension, notice the raising of the voice or the fanaticism, and there's a collapsed energy that comes from it, right? It's like, I feel like I'm fighting and struggling and pushing, and you just, you feel it, right?
You can feel it's usually like a constricted, maybe in your chest or in your head. People feel it in different places.
Your neck comes down, your shoulders come up, we all know it.
So notice that. Start paying attention to those feelings.
The second is paying attention to other people. So if people are reacting to you with force,
you're probably,
then that is a mirror for you.
Yeah.
That means that they're reacting to your force.
Yeah. Good point.
And sometimes that's hard, right? Because the situation, we've already got our story. We've convinced ourselves of all the facts. The listeners to us, I guarantee you, use facts in their force.
Yeah.
So when you're sharing your facts and you're making your case and you're fighting your fight, and you notice that other people are reacting with force, maybe it's leaders or others. Ding, 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 ding. Clue, you're using force.
Yeah.
And then what you can do is, if you can, this is where I say it's simple, but it's not easy, is if you can really plot yourself to some extent, like, I'm getting angry, I'm getting frustrated, I'm getting disappointed, all those emotional, lower vibrating emotions.
Yeah.
Then if you can notice what it is, then you can start, like you said, like you can start stepping yourself up the scale. Yes. But it can't be fake. It has to be, you have to find the power.
Yeah.
And so one of the techniques that actually we both were introduced by one of your clients, is these reminders. I call them yeah, they're just kind of like trinkets or things to remind, rituals or whatever, to
Mm.
remind
Yes. Yeah.
us to f- to be more of power and less of force.
Yeah.
And like, I think she listens to us, Bonnie, right? It's Bonnie.
Bonnie. Yeah. Hi,
Hi,
Bonnie.
Bonnie. Bonnie, she taps her chest to remind herself to
Yeah.
go into her heart, right? Go
Yeah.
in my heart. What does my heart want to do in this situation? Because
Yeah.
your intuition and your heart are your internal power.
Yeah.
The other one that I really love is I sometimes I used to carry a stone in my pocket,
I
and
still do that.
and I
Yeah.
put my hand in my pocket and I feel that stone, and it would remind me to be kind and compassionate.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a lot of things you can do like that.
yeah, just to position yourself. Um, you can even have set an intention at the beginning of your day,
I
uh,
do that every day
and
before
and
I
and
meditate.
or say a prayer,
Hmm.
or
Yeah.
just remind yourself as much as you can to
Mhm.
step into power. Move through your day in a position of power,
Yeah.
not in a position of force.
And the key is to practice, because that's where you're going to make a shift. Is if you have to repeat things. It's just like trying to break a habit or create a habit. You have to repeat, 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 and then
Yeah,
eventually becomes easier. So it could be frustrating in the beginning, but eventually you get it.
I will say this though, just so um, everyone knows and understands that your power, your is a divine right. You were born with your power. Uh,
Yes.
there's nothing to learn. There's nothing to acquire. There's nothing to um, uh, like practice from the standpoint of practice to get good at it.
Right. It's
Um,
there. It's always there.
it's there and it's in your heart and it sits in your heart, and
Yeah.
it 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 doesn't leave you. It doesn't
Mm.
get tired of your force and go, never mind. It's always with you.
Yeah. It's
And
always there.
um,
Patient. It's very patient.
yeah, and it's,
Yeah.
in spirituality, there's a lot to talk about the Christ body, or the Christ, the Christ mind, or being Christ like. And it's not just a Christian term. It's a in New Age spirituality and everything else. It's there in all of those. And
Yeah.
in essence, that is that ultimate power. That is moving through the world in a very powerful way versus moving in through the world in a very forceful way.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I was going to, kind of a practical thing, is so like we talked about, noticing in your body or noticing how somebody else reacts is a nice way to, you know, catch yourself
Hmm.
falling into force, or whatever you want to call it. Um, the other kind of real practical tip is if you're a person who reflects. I reflect every night. I built that habit. If you're a person who reflects, as you reflect on your day, um, if you can create a column, um, or two columns down the reflection. So I know some people aren't watching this on YouTube, but you have a column for what you're reflecting on,
Hmm.
and then you have a column on whether that is a F or a P. And and
Mm.
and you can kind of like, okay, um, in my discussion with Roberta, it kind of got heated and it got a little political, and I could tell she was frustrated with me, and I felt like I needed to fight her and her,
Which
whatever.
never happens when Roberta, she's probably listening. It never happens. A different Roberta.
Yeah, I guess I just randomly chose the name Roberta, but
That's
you
my
get the
very good
idea.
friend, Roberta.
But you write that story, right? You're reflecting on it. You're like,
Yeah, so you could
yeah.
I like that, put an F in there. So you start sort of tracking.
And then
Yeah,
in the second
great
column,
idea.
document the emotion, your
Mm,
emotion.
yeah,
Um,
Or how the feeling you felt in your body.
Yeah. Yeah. The point of that is not so much to dwell in the emotion or bring the emotion back or any of that kind of stuff. It
Mm-hmm.
is to start pinpointing, a kind of a cause and effect. What is it that you're putting down, or in that situation, where were you on that consciousness spectrum?
Yeah.
And then you can look at the next step or the next couple steps up and say, what would that situation look like if I would have been there versus where I was?
Yeah, I love that. That's great.
And all that's to do is just to serve your awareness.
Yep.
So you can make a conscious choice to not exert force, but to exert power.
Yeah. It just takes baby steps to get yourself to that point.
So force versus power.
Yeah. Great discussion. I think a lot of people will benefit from this.
I hope so. I really do.
People deal with that. You deal with it all day long. All day long. You
do.
Even with your pets.
Yeah. And I'd love to, I coach leaders, and this is one of the topics that is near and dear to my heart when I talk to leaders in particular, because authority tends to feel like it requires force. Our society kind of feels like it needs to exert force. And so to accomplish things, sometimes you have to force things to happen.
Yeah.
And so if you're a leader and you're listening to this podcast, you in particular, I mean, all of us, but you in particular, because you are influencing others, you in particular, I encourage you and invite you to use power in all circumstances versus force. The result will be incredibly different. And here's another interesting thing before we sign off. In that David Hawking, he has an organization, he's passed away, but he has an organization that actually measures the collective force versus power, and on that consciousness spectrum. And it doesn't tell just in recent times, like the last year or so, that the collective consciousness of the world has crossed that threshold.
Oh, nice.
We've moved from 100 and something to just barely like 201.
That's good. That's good news.
But it's very encouraging. It means as a society, we're starting to become step more into our power and become less forceful.
Yeah.
I
love it.
All the mainstream media is not going to tell you about that, but to our listeners, just be encouraged to know that as a collective, we're turning a tide in this particular area. So
yeah.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks for listening. We get excited about these topics and they fly by. At least for me, I can speak for me. If you're interested in wanting to know more about force versus power, certainly read the book.
Yeah, it's a good book. Go
to the Facebook Practical Consciousness Podcast Facebook group page. Join in the conversation. If you have examples or want to understand more about force versus power, go there,
ask a question. Questions. We're there. We're in and out of there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we'll say goodbye and thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.